In 2011, a strange machine about the size of a small car washed up on the coast of Croatia. The machine was clearly of an intricate and sophisticated design, but badly damaged. In particular, two cylinders that had presumably once been filled with some substance vital to the working of the machine had been broken open on the rocks and washed absolutely clean by the action of the sea. Numerous scientists and members of the public have weighed in on the likely or possible use of the machine, but no definitive conclusion has been reached. 2 days later, the body of a man, badly decomposed, was found on the same beach. Attempts were made to identify him, with no success. And then, in 2015, an Italian newspaper received a curious letter, written entirely in English. The letter's author identified himself only as K. The letter purported to explain the purpose of the machine and the identity of the corpse. But the story that it told was considered so implausible and bizarre that the letter was never published. The letter claimed not only to know the precise purpose of the device, but also linked it to an alleged plague that supposedly struck a certain Italian town around the same time. I have obtained a copy of this letter, and I will now reproduce it in full. To whom it may concern. There has been much speculation on the purpose of the device that washed up on the island of Bermuda 4 years ago. I happen to have been acquainted with this device before it plunged into the sea, and I will explain here exactly what it once was. Although I am British, I have lived for many years in a town called Nientina on the coast of Italy. In 2009, I happened to make the acquaintance of a fellow Englishman, also living in the same town. I will call him S. S and I had a shared interest in philosophy and passed many hours discussing philosophical matters in a certain cafe. I will explain a little of S's ideas, since they may be relevant to the functioning of the device to which your newspaper has devoted so much ink. Essentially, S argued that rather than seeing human consciousness as arising from the physical material of the universe, we should view the physical material of the universe as being just one more experience that human consciousness may conjure, among others. He pointed out that the brain receives only colourless, odourless nerve impulses, from which it assembles an entire experience of the world, including colours, odours, a sense of space, an experience of physical matter, and so on. Thus he regarded mind and not matter to be the fundamental building block of the universe. He claimed that the laws of physics are only a kind of provisional agreement adopted via a sort of subconscious consensus, enabling us to interact with each other. This train of thought had somehow led him to the conclusion that these laws can be broken, if done in a way consistent with other agreed upon laws. He believed that any injudicious reordering of physical laws by an individual would be seen by others as death or madness. I myself am a materialist, and I didn't take his views very seriously until one day he invited me to observe a machine that he had constructed in his garage. The thing was about the size and shape of a small round coffee table, except there was a mass of wiring and several metal cylinders underneath it. On the table was a digital balance, and on the balance stood a standardized 50-gram weight. "Watch this," said S, and he flicked a switch. There was a sound like the motor of an electric car gathering speed, and a faint blue glow appeared around the apparatus. "Are you sure this is safe?" I asked. "Of course," said S. He pointed to some shelves adjacent to the device. "They're absolutely fine, and they've been exposed to it far more than you will be." There on the shelves were some cages containing rats or mice. True enough, the animals seemed quite happy. He had taken care to provide them with wheels and tunnels and other toys. I'm fairly sure unlicensed animal experiments are illegal in Italy, but doubtless he could claim they were pets, and after all, I don't suppose he was injecting them with anything or operating on them. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" I asked as the machine revved up. "Any moment now," said S. "Watch the scales." As the whirring of the device reached a high pitch, the weight displayed on the scales started to decrease, from 50 grams to 49 grams, and eventually all the way down to 32 grams. "Electromagnetic repulsion, I assume," I said. "You assume wrong," said S. "Not electromagnetic repulsion, gravitational." "Impossible," I said. "You've made a mistake somewhere." "Would you agree that a block of wood cannot be repelled by magnetic fields?" said S. "Of course," I said. "Then let's try it," he said. He switched the machine off. It took about a minute to power down. Then he replaced the metal weight with a block of wood, also weighing 50 grams. Again he switched the machine on, and again the weight displayed on the balance gradually decreased to 32 grams. "Something's probably going wrong with the balance," I suggested. "Pick the block of wood up and hold it just above the scales," he said. I did so, noting that my hand felt curiously light when I moved it across the device, and while I was holding the block of wood, he switched the machine off. The block seemed to increase in weight very perceptibly. "I don't know how you're doing it," I said, "but I would be very reluctant to attribute it to any anti-gravitational effect, unless absolutely all other possibilities have been eliminated. You wouldn't be the first person to wrongly think he's created anti-gravity." "You're right to be sceptical," said S. "Most people who think they've discovered anti-gravity are simply deluded. I'm the only exception, and I'll prove it to you. I'm going to build a machine you can ride around on." "If you can manage to do that," I said, "I'll be the first to admit that you're one of the greatest geniuses who has ever lived." S smiled quietly to himself. Not long after this, S asked to borrow a considerable sum of money from me. I was surprised because it didn't seem typical of his character. Even so, I happened to be rather wealthy. The sum he asked wasn't a lot to me, and I found S very entertaining, so I gave him the money. He promised to show me something astonishing in return. I didn't really expect to ever get it back. I privately wondered whether I was simply enabling a terrible charlatan, but if S was a terrible charlatan, he was certainly an amusing one. I can forgive almost anyone for anything, as long as they've amused me. Two months later, S asked me to come with him to a village outside the town. For some unfathomable reason, he insisted we had to go there at 5 in the morning, an ungodly hour to which I frankly prefer not to be a witness whenever possible. He brought me to a barn which he'd hired, using the money I loaned to him. "Are you ready?" he said, holding the barn door. "For what?" I said. "The surprise of your life," he said. "Try me." He opened the door, and inside the barn, illuminated by half a dozen bright white garden lights, was a huge blue thing, shaped like a lozenge, suspended about 5 feet in the air by some scaffolding. "What in the name of God is that?" I said. By way of reply, he took a remote control from his pocket and pressed a button on it. A hatch opened in the bottom of the blue lozenge, and a ladder slowly extended itself to the floor. "Come and see for yourself," he said, and he waved me towards the ladder. I climbed inside and found myself in some sort of control room. 2 bucket seats were arranged one behind the other, and at the front were 2 joysticks and an array of instruments illuminated in blue. I saw that from the inside, the blue skin of the lozenge appeared almost completely transparent, only a faint tinted glass effect separating us from the barn. "Sit down," he said, and I sat in the rear seat, figuring that if we were going anywhere in this thing, he'd be the one piloting it. A far more likely possibility than going anywhere seemed to me that he'd simply gone out of his mind and lost himself in a fantasy realm of magic flying blimps. He clambered into the cockpit and pressed some switches. I saw that the roof of the barn was beginning to open above us. For the first time, I began to feel somewhat nervous. Was this great blue thing actually safe? "You see, I've disguised it as a balloon," he said. "If anyone spots us, they'll just think a weather balloon has blown off course or something." Then he added, "I thought it was only fair that you should be the first person after myself to take a ride in it, since you paid for it to be built." "Look here, S," I said, "what's actually going on?" Where the roof of the barn had been, I could now see only a starry expanse of sky, tinted with just the merest hint of dawn. He was busy flicking switches and adjusting dials and didn't seem to hear me. There was a sound like multiple electric motors getting up to speed, and various lights and dials and indicators to S's left and right were showing increasing levels of something. I was on the verge of insisting he let me out when I felt an odd sensation, somewhat like the feeling you get during minor earthquakes if you've ever experienced one, and I saw that the barn was moving downwards, or rather, the machine was moving upwards, and us with it. We rose towards the open roof and then above it, and continued to rise until we were perhaps 200 meters above the ground. Peering down through the transparent skin of the machine, I saw the lights of the barn below, and houses doubtless filled with still sleeping people. In the distance, a solitary car wound its way along a road, and the first rays of sun were beginning to turn the horizon a deep reddish purple. "We're flying," I said aghast. "Damned if we aren't actually flying." I looked all around the machine and could see no means of support. There was no crane holding us up, nor any great balloon pulling us into the sky. The machine was flying all by itself without jets or propellers or wings, or any other conventional mechanism associated with flight. "May I assume now you agree that I have indeed discovered the secret of antigravity," said S. I tried to speak, but I could only manage an astonished splutter. "I'll take that as a yes," said S. The machine began to move forward, rooftops passing below us, and confused early birds circling around us. I began to feel a marvellous sense of euphoria. "You've actually done it!" I shouted. I could see we were moving rapidly towards the town. If you've ever been to Nientina, you'll know it has one of the best preserved medieval walls in the whole of Italy. The wall was built to withstand cannon fire on account of the continual wars between the medieval city-state of Nientina and its neighbour across the hills inland, Qualcona. The walls are thick enough to support a road, which both locals and tourists like to walk on. As we approached the town, S made the machine fly over this wall, and we began to follow it, circling the town. S, this is incredible, I said. You're a genius. Of course I am, he said, laughing. You thought I was deluded, right? I thought you were completely mad, I said. We began to laugh uproariously. Every care I ever had was forgotten thanks to the glorious sensation of flying, high above the old wall, in a machine that should not and could not exist, and yet did. As we continued to circle the wall, the sun broke over the horizon. Down below, a handful of curious runners and dog walkers stopped to gaze up at the giant blue balloon that was improbably making its way along the wall. On the one side we gazed down upon the spires of Nientina's many churches. To the east we could see far across the Adriatic Sea, and to the north and west the mountains that form Italy's spine. Finally, as the sun rose higher, I said, "If you want to keep this a secret, we'd better go back." "True enough," he said. We left the wall and crossed over the town. If only we had turned back when we were at the other side of the wall, that wouldn't have been necessary. Now it is too late to do anything about it. Several people stopped where they were to openly gawp at the strange balloon that blew across their heads and roofs, but soon we were floating silently back into the open barn roof. "So what are you going to do now?" I asked as we descended the ladder to the barn floor. "Publish," he said. "I'm going to share this secret with the whole world, but not quite yet. No one will believe me if I try to publish a paper claiming to have discovered antigravity. And anyway, these journals take a damnably long time to publish anything at all. So before I tell anyone how I did it, I'm going to show them what I've done. I'd be honoured if you'd join me on the first official public flight of this beast in 3 days' time. We'll make the same trip again, but this time during daylight and without the disguise." "The honour would be all mine," I said. Two days later, I was at home quietly reading when I received a distressed call from S. "Come at once," he said. "Please hurry." When I arrived at his house, I found him in a state of enormous distress. He insisted on taking me directly to the garage where he had performed his earlier experiments. "It's the mice," he said. "Look at them." The mice were all dead or dying. They seemed to have bled to death from their mouths or noses. Some of them had attacked each other in their death throes and had died locked in combat. The ones that were still alive were already bleeding and clearly ill. I felt desperately sorry for them. "What happened to them?" I said. "S, you need to euthanize the living ones. This is horrible." He grabbed me by the lapels of my jacket. "The anti-gravity rays," he said. "They must have some kind of delayed effect on living things. They're lethal." He was white as a sheet and shaking. "Do you mean to say we're going to die?" I said. "No, not us," he said. "I've done calculations, based on the distance of the mouse cage, the size of the mice, and the strength of the rays. Look." He picked up a sheaf of papers and laid them out on a desk. "This is the relevant parameter," he said. tapping a Greek letter. I haven't done maths since college, I said. What does it all mean? The rays produced by this small device weren't enough to affect animals of our size, he said. And when we flew in the larger device, we were shielded from the rays. I arranged shielding so we wouldn't float in our seats. Then everything's okay, I said. No, he said. Everything is not okay. The people underneath us, they were exposed to huge doses. Not enough to make them float, but my God. He suddenly broke off in a sob, holding his head in his hands. What? I said. Kilo for kilo, some of them must have received a dose at least as large as the mice, he said. There was a silence while I digested this information, and he stood there shaking like a leaf. Finally I said, "Now look here, they're mice." I waved towards the cages. "We are human beings, an entirely different type of animal. You don't know that these rays will affect human beings in the same way as mice. Just keep the machine on the ground till you've got to the bottom of this." "I suppose you could be right," he said. He was staring wild-eyed into space and covering his mouth with his hand. I've never seen a man in such a profound state of shock. "Of course I'm right," I said. "Tell you what, let's go into your house and I'll pour you a gin. Look at the state of you, man." Of course he was highly strung and prone to terrible fits of emotional instability like all geniuses. I was only surprised I hadn't seen it before. Galileo and Newton were probably the same. S did calm down a bit after I got some gin into him, but he insisted his calculations were at least plausible. By flying around the wall and over the town, we had exposed the inhabitants of Nientina to significant risk. There was nothing further to do other than wait and see if any of them became ill. The next 2 weeks were stressful, to say the least. S seemed barely able to hold it together. I was having terrible nightmares in which the whole of Nientina gathered outside my house, bleeding and screaming for my death as the streets became strewn with corpses. And what if? What if S was right and large numbers of people were about to die because of us? As far as I could see, my role in the whole thing was minimal. I didn't even know what the blue lozenge thing was when I got into it, but I had funded its creation, that much was true. And perhaps S would never even have fabricated the device had it not been for my skepticism. My conscience didn't rest easy, no matter how I tried to rationalise the whole thing. As for S, how could he have known? He had made an astonishing discovery and could hardly have foreseen the delayed effects of the rays. Even so, he had taken every possible precaution, going so far as to keep mice in his garage so that he could carefully observe their health. Didn't Marie and Pierre Curie walk around with vials of radium in their pockets? Didn't Marie's notebooks have to be kept in lead-lined boxes for years after she had died? Probably some people died early because they were exposed to the Curie's radium, but no one would hold the Curies responsible for that. As far as I could see, S was innocent of any wrongdoing, but the people of Nientina probably wouldn't see it that way if corpses started turning up. After 2 weeks had passed, we were beginning to relax. S's nerves were beginning to get back onto an even keel. He had, as I suggested, panicked over nothing. No one was dying. No one was falling ill. We were scanning the obituary columns eagerly and fretfully every day, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. And then a terrible thing occurred. S was walking to his barn, planning to run through some more calculations when he came upon a dead cat. The cat belonged to the people who lived in the house nearest to his barn. The poor thing had bled from its nose before dying. S ran to the house and, to his immense relief, found the elderly couple out in their garden enjoying the sun. Following that, we hypothesized that the rays only affected small mammals, with their effects on humans likely being minimal. We were wrong. The elderly couple was found dead 2 days later. S was near hysteria. I tried to calm him by pointing out that probably no one had been exposed to the rays at such close quarters as that couple. They were well over 80 and might have died before too long in any case. I told him he'd surely be dead himself if the rays were so dangerous, but he insisted the real danger came from being underneath the machine while it was operating, in the zone where the anti-gravitational effect occurred. The mice, I suggested, had died only because he had deliberately placed them in the danger zone as a precaution, expecting them to be perfectly fine. For another 3 days we waited, hoping against hope that no further deaths would occur, and then it started. The obituaries began to fill with people dying of a mysterious disease. The authorities scrambled to find the cause. The water supply was suspected, and then air pollution, and then the local bread, and then the flu. No infectious agent could be found, but people widely believed some unknown infectious agent was responsible. Death after death occurred, people abruptly bleeding from their noses and sometimes ears, often falling where they stood. An epidemic was declared and Nientina was, in effect, sealed off from the outside world. Locally, the phenomenon was known as the Plague of Nientina, but the Italian government carefully suppressed all mention of it in the national press for fear of causing a mass panic. Neither did the international press report it. As for social media, that was rigorously censored. For nearly a week we opened the obituaries every day to find another 2 or 3 people had died from the plague. Then the authorities began to close in on S's machine. It had taken them a week to connect the initial deaths of the elderly couple to the phenomenon, but finally they realised that these were indeed the first people to die from it. The couple hadn't been abroad in decades, so it appeared that the source must be local, and the police began sniffing around S's barn. One day I awoke to find S had sent me an email. In it, he thanked me for my support and called me a true friend. The responsibility for recent events, he said, was all his. The email ended with goodbye. I hurried to his house, hoping he wasn't about to do anything rash, and found it empty. The garage door was unlocked, and that too was empty. Then I made my way to his barn, hoping the police wouldn't catch me, since at that point we were only allowed out of our houses to do shopping in an effort to control the supposed plague. The barn was on fire and surrounded by fire engines and police. I didn't dare approach it. I knew the authorities would have questions that I didn't much feel like answering. At home, I drank the best part of a bottle of wine. I was wondering if S was in that barn when he doubtless set light to it. 2 days later, I was able to read the news report on the fire. No body had been found there. I was immensely relieved, but that did raise the question of where S was. It was a month later that the machine washed up on the Croatian coast. I was checking the news from the countries surrounding Italy every day. looking for unusual sightings of balloons or evidence that the plague of Nientina had spread. The article about the thing that had washed up on Bermuda caught my eye right away. From the description of the device and the photograph that accompanied the article in the Vecchiani list, I believe it was indeed the remains of S's machine. As for the corpse that washed up 2 days later, the most likely possibility is that was the corpse of my friend S. I cannot say whether S committed suicide or had attempted to flee the police across the Adriatic, only to run out of power before he reached his destination. I am certain regardless that he took every possible precaution to ensure that his flight path caused no further casualties. There is of course another possibility, that the machine was indeed S's machine, but the corpse was not his corpse. S may have ditched his machine off the coast, and the corpse could easily be that of some random fisherman or murder victim, entirely unassociated with the whole thing. I prefer to believe this latter possibility. S may still be out there somewhere, doubtless racked with guilt, but trying to figure out why the emanations from his machine were so deadly, so that anti-gravity may be harnessed for the good of humanity. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please go immediately to Croatia and attempt to determine whether S is alive or dead. Also, if you would consider subscribing, that would help me to gain favour with the algorithm gods. Thank you. My name's John and you have been listening to Science Horror. New episodes every Monday.